My wealthy husband left me everything: a beach house and $7.5 million. My parents, who abandoned me 18 years ago, suddenly showed up at the will reading. "We are your guardians," they smiled. But when my lawyer came in, they turned pale. My name is Valerie, and at 34 years old, I am an estate liquidator. I handle the messy business of clearing out the dead. I just never expected my biggest job would be liquidating my own toxic family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up, I learned early on that family does not mean loyalty. My parents, Vivian and Roland, cared only about appearances and social status. When they saved enough money to move to the affluent suburbs, they left me behind. They decided I was too rebellious, too attached to my grandmother, and too dark-skinned to fit into their curated high society image. For 18 long years, I built my life completely without them. I married Julian, a brilliant financial investor who loved me exactly as I was. But 2 weeks ago, my entire world collapsed when Julian died suddenly. Now, I sat in the cold leather chair of Elias, my trust lawyer. The mahogany walls of his downtown office felt suffocating. Julian and I had built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not need the spotlight. We just had each other. The grief was still raw, a heavy physical weight pressing firmly on my chest. Elias was adjusting his reading glasses, preparing to go over the final transfer of the $7.5 million estate and the beachfront property. The room was perfectly silent. Then the heavy oak doors swung open without a knock. I did not even have to turn around to recognize the overpowering scent of my mother Vivian and her expensive department store perfume. Her loud footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. It was not just her. My father Roland followed close behind, adjusting his silk tie. Next came my younger sister Jasmine, the golden child who could do no wrong. And right beside her was her husband Trevor, a white real estate broker who always acted like he owned every room he walked into. I had not spoken to my parents in 18 years, not since they decided my grandmother and I were not good enough for their new life. Now here they were, standing in my lawyer's private office. Vivian smiled a terrifying, hollow smile. "Valerie, sweetie, we are here for you. We know you are lost without Julian." I stared at them, my face perfectly blank, refusing to show emotion. Elias stood up from his desk, frowning deeply. "Excuse me, this is a private legal meeting." Trevor stepped forward, puffing out his chest with arrogance. He threw a thick manila folder onto Elias' desk. The official papers slid out, spilling across the wood surface. Trevor smirked, looking down at me as if I were a helpless child. "It is not private anymore, Elias. We are stepping in. Valerie is clearly suffering from severe psychological trauma and immense grief. She is mentally unstable and completely unfit to manage an estate of this size." Elias picked up the top document with trembling hands. His eyes widened in disbelief. I glanced over at the paper. It was a medical certificate claiming I had suffered a mental breakdown, signed by a doctor I had never met. Trevor leaned casually against the desk, crossing his arms confidently. I pulled some strings with a medical associate of mine. "We have officially filed for an emergency conservatorship. Roland and Vivian are now her legal financial guardians. For her own protection, of course." Jasmine chimed in, dabbing a fake tear from her dry eyes. "You have always been so fragile, Valerie. We just want to take care of you and the money. You could easily get scammed by strangers. You are just an estate liquidator. You clean out old junk for a living. You do not know the first thing about managing millions of dollars." Vivian stepped closer and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. I could feel her sharp nails digging into my blazer. "You made a terrible mistake staying in the projects with your broke Nana 18 years ago instead of moving to the wealthy suburbs with us. You never learned how to handle real wealth. Let your family fix this mess for you." Elias' face turned bright red with anger. He opened his mouth to object, to tell them this was illegal fraud. I raised my right hand, silencing him immediately. The room went dead quiet. I did not scream at them. I did not cry or beg. I did not stand up and throw them out. I just looked at Trevor, who was beaming with arrogant pride. I looked at my mother, who was already scanning the elegant office like she owned the entire firm. They thought I was incredibly weak. They thought I was the same terrified 16-year-old girl they abandoned all those years ago. They thought Julian leaving me this money meant I was an easy target for their greed. I reached slowly into my black leather purse. My fingers brushed against the heavy brass keys to the beachfront house. I pulled them out and placed them gently on top of their fake medical documents. The cold metal clinked against the wood desk. I looked directly into Trevor's eyes. "You really want to be my financial guardians?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and steady. Trevor grinned widely, snatching the keys off the desk. "It is already done, Valerie. We will take it from here." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. "Good luck," I said softly. They turned and walked out, celebrating their effortless victory. Elias looked at me completely confused. "Valerie," he whispered, "what are you doing?" I just smiled, looking at the empty doorway. "Let them have the keys, Elias. They just locked themselves inside their own prison. I knew exactly what I was doing and they had no idea." Elias sank back into his heavy leather chair, shaking his head in disbelief. "Valerie, you cannot be serious," he pleaded. "They are going to drain every account Julian left you. Trevor is a shark in a cheap suit and your mother is not far behind. They will liquidate your assets faster than you can blink." I walked over to the large window overlooking the city skyline. "Julian was a lot of things, Elias, but he was never careless," I said smoothly. "Do you really think my brilliant husband, who spent 20 years outsmarting Wall Street executives, would leave his entire fortune sitting in a vulnerable checking account?" Elias paused, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand. He knew Julian better than anyone, but he did not know the specific contingency plans Julian and I had put in place the moment my family tried to reach out to us a year ago. "They want to be my financial guardians." I continued, turning back to face him. "They want to take on all the legal responsibilities of my estate, so let them. File the paperwork, Elias. Make sure Trevor signs his name on every single dotted line. Bind his personal assets to my conservatorship, just like the law requires." Elias slowly picked up a gold pen, tapping it against the mahogany desk. A slow smile crept across his weathered face as the realization hit him. "You are setting a trap," he whispered. "I am not setting anything," I replied, grabbing my purse. "They built the cage themselves. I am just locking the door." By the next morning, the invasion of my beachfront property had officially begun. I pulled up to the driveway and saw Trevor directing a massive moving truck. My parents and sister had wasted absolutely no time. They were moving into my $800,000 sanctuary. The house Julian and I had meticulously decorated with pieces from our travels was now being overrun by the very people who threw me away. The peaceful sound of the ocean waves was drowned out by Trevor shouting orders at the movers. I walked through the front door, and the chaos hit me instantly. Jasmine was standing in the center of the living room wearing designer sunglasses indoors. She was pointing at Julian vintage record collection and his hand-carved chess set. "Throw all of this trash out," she commanded the movers. "It smells like old people, and it totally ruins the modern coastal aesthetic I am going for." I stood in the doorway watching her discard my husband's memories like they were meaningless garbage. My chest tightened with a profound grief, but I forced my face to remain perfectly blank. This was part of the process. To catch a thief, you have to let them think they have already stolen the prize. Jasmine spotted me and flipped her long hair over her shoulder. "Oh good, you are here, Valerie," she sighed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Trevor said, you need to clear your stuff out of the master bedroom immediately. He needs the home office space for his real estate conference calls, so you are going to be staying in the basement. It is unfinished and dark down there, but you are used to the dark, right? You know, since you lived in that gloomy project housing with Nana for so long." I did not argue with her. I quietly walked upstairs and packed a single small suitcase. The master bedroom still smelled faintly of Julian cologne. I traced my fingers over his side of the bed, feeling a sharp physical ache in my heart. They thought they were breaking my spirit by forcing me into the basement like a servant. What they did not know was that the basement housed the main server rack for the entire property. It was the absolute best place for me to monitor everything they were doing undetected. Later that evening, the reality of my new life as a captive in my own home fully set in. Trevor had invited 3 of his white real estate partners over for drinks to celebrate his massive new acquisition. He was parading around the living room acting like a billionaire. He was pouring expensive scotch from Julian Private Reserve into crystal glasses. The men were laughing loudly, completely ignoring my presence as a grieving widow. Trevor snapped his fingers at me from across the room. "Hey, Valerie, go fetch us some more ice and make sure the glasses are actually clean this time," he ordered with a smug grin. I walked to the kitchen, my hands gripping the cold marble countertop until my knuckles turned white. My mother Vivian was leaning against the stainless steel refrigerator sipping a glass of champagne. She looked me up and down with utter disgust. "Look at you," she sneered. "You are pathetic. You are. You let a man boss you around in your own house. This is exactly why you need us, Valerie. You have zero backbone and no sense of pride." She set her glass down and stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "You always were the weak one. When you were 16, you chose to stay with that broke old woman instead of coming to the wealthy suburbs with us. You threw away your entire future for useless sentimentality. Look at your sister Jasmine. She married a man who knows how to build an empire and take control, and you married a man who died and left you completely helpless. You should be on your knees thanking us for stepping in to save you from your own stupidity." I looked right into her cold eyes. My mother was a master of emotional manipulation. She thrived on tearing people down to make herself feel taller. For 18 years, her cruel words would have crushed me into pieces. But standing there in that kitchen, I felt absolutely nothing but pity for her shallow existence. "Are you done, Mother?" I asked, my voice dead calm. "Make sure you sleep well tonight. You have a big day of spending my money tomorrow." Vivian's face twisted in sudden anger, and she slapped my hand hard away from the counter. "Do not ever use that tone with me, you ungrateful brat," she hissed before storming out of the kitchen to rejoin the party. She was completely unaware that she had just signed her own financial death warrant. At 2 in the morning, the house was completely silent. Everyone was asleep upstairs, dreaming of the millions they thought they had stolen from me. I sat in the cold, dark basement, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The bright glow of my laptop screen illuminated my face. Julian was a genius when it came to corporate legal structures. The $7.5 million was not liquid cash sitting in a bank. It was heavily guarded under a private holding company. And by claiming legal and financial guardianship over my estate, Trevor had blindly linked his own failing brokerage firm directly to our secure corporate network. I typed a sequence of complex passwords into the main terminal. The screen shifted, revealing the complete financial profiles of my parents, my sister, and Trevor. The dashboard blinked steadily, waiting for my final command. I reviewed the conservatorship clause Trevor had so proudly presented to Elias earlier that day. By legally binding his name to mine, he had opened the door for complete asset absorption. I moved the cursor to the bottom of the screen. The button read, "Execute Debt Acquisition." I pressed enter. The screen flashed a brilliant green. The transfer was complete. The trap was successfully set. They thought they had taken everything from me. They had no idea I now owned them completely. The very next morning, a massive moving truck pulled into the gravel driveway of my beach house. I stood on the porch watching as my family descended upon the property, like a swarm of locusts. Trevor stepped out of his leased Mercedes, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He looked at the ocean view and nodded in approval as if he had built the house with his own 2 hands. My mother, Vivian, walked right past me without saying a word. Her eyes were already scanning the pristine landscaping, calculating how much it would elevate her social status. Jasmine was the loudest. She strutted up the wooden steps holding her designer handbag. She pushed past my shoulder and walked straight into the living room. I followed them inside, keeping my face completely blank. The house still smelled like Julian. His favorite sandalwood candles were still on the mantel. His reading glasses were still resting on the coffee table. Within minutes, Jasmine started tearing the place apart. She picked up a hand-painted vase we had bought on our honeymoon in Italy and scowled. "This is incredibly tacky," she announced to no one in particular. She tossed it unceremoniously into a black garbage bag. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I did not say a word. Then she grabbed a framed photograph of Julian and me from our wedding day. The frame was carved from driftwood. Jasmine sneered at it and tossed it toward the trash bag, but she missed. The frame hit the hardwood floor and shattered into pieces. The glass cracked right across Julian's smiling face. "Oops," Jasmine said with a careless shrug. "You should probably sweep that up, Valerie, before someone steps on it." She turned around and walked toward the kitchen, complaining about the color of the cabinets. I knelt down on the floor and carefully picked up the broken pieces of glass. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. They were shaking with a cold, calculated anger. I slipped the torn photograph into my pocket. Trevor came walking down the hallway, clapping his hands together loudly. "All right, everyone, let us get settled," he announced. "Valerie, your mother and father will take the guest suite on the first floor. Jasmine and I will be taking the master bedroom upstairs. The lighting is better for her social media photos, and I need the attached office for my real estate calls." I stood up, holding the broken frame. "The master bedroom is where my husband and I slept," I said, my voice low and steady. "All of his clothes are still in the closet." Trevor let out a condescending laugh. "Well then, you better start packing them up quickly," he replied. "You do not need that much space anymore anyway. You can take the unfinished basement down the hall. It has a small cot and a bathroom. It is perfectly fine for someone in your fragile mental state." He smirked, enjoying the power trip. My mother walked into the hallway and nodded in agreement. "Trevor is right, Valerie," she said smoothly. "You need a quiet, dark place to process your grief. The master bedroom is far too grand for a single woman anyway. Plus, you are used to living in cramped spaces. Remember that tiny apartment you shared with Nana? This should feel right at home for you." I looked at the two of them, absorbing their cruelty. They really thought they were breaking me. They thought pushing me into the basement would make me feel small and insignificant. They did not know that the basement was exactly where I wanted to be. The basement housed the main security server and the estate financial network terminal. It was the brain of the entire property. "Fine," I said softly. "I will move my things to the basement." Trevor smiled, looking victorious. "Excellent," he said. "Now that we have the living arrangement sorted, we are going to need dinner. Moving is exhausting work. Jasmine wants sea bass, and I would prefer a medium-rare steak. There is a grocery store 2 miles down the road. Make sure you use your own money to buy the groceries, Valerie. Your estate accounts are currently frozen until I finish the legal transition." He tossed me a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket. It fluttered to the floor, landing near my shoes. I stared at the money and then looked up at him. "You want me to cook dinner for you?" I asked. Trevor crossed his arms. "You are living under my roof now, Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You have to pull your weight. Consider it rent for the basement. Do not burn the steak." He turned around and walked upstairs, whistling a cheerful tune. Jasmine followed him, complaining that the stairs were too steep. My mother gave me one last pitiful look before heading to her new suite. I stood alone in the hallway of my own home. I reached down and picked up the $20 bill. They wanted to treat me like the help. They wanted to humiliate me in the house my husband built for us. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed my car keys. I would buy their steak. I would cook their dinner. I would play the role of the broken, defeated widow perfectly. Because every second they spent feeling powerful was another second they spent ignoring the invisible net closing in around them. They had no idea who Julian really was, and they had no idea what I was capable of. I drove to the grocery store feeling the cool ocean breeze through my open window. The reality of the situation was almost comical. My family had forcefully taken over my estate, and now they were demanding I act as their personal chef. I walked through the aisles picking out the exact cuts of meat Trevor requested. I selected the fresh sea bass for my sister. I even bought the expensive organic vegetables my mother always pretended to like. I paid with the $20 bill and covered the rest with my own hidden cash. When I returned to the beach house, the sun was beginning to set over the water. The house was filled with the sound of loud television and Jasmine complaining about the wireless internet speed. I quietly went to the kitchen and began to prepare the meal. I seasoned the steak carefully. I seared the fish just the way Julian used to do it. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air. For a moment, I closed my eyes and pretended Julian was standing right beside me pouring a glass of wine. But then Trevor yelled from the living room telling me to hurry up. The illusion shattered. I plated the food and carried the heavy trays into the formal dining room. My parents and my sister were already seated at the large mahogany table. Trevor was sitting at the head of the table in Julian's chair. He did not even look up from his phone when I placed his plate in front of him. Jasmine poked at her fish with a silver fork. "It looks a little dry, Valerie," she noted, rolling her eyes. "But I suppose I can manage." My father, Roland, finally spoke, cutting into his steak. "The lawn out front needs some work," he said with his mouth full. "Make sure you contact a landscaper tomorrow, Valerie. We cannot have the neighbors thinking we do not maintain our property. We have a reputation to uphold now." I stood by the edge of the table holding an empty tray. "Yes, father," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Trevor took a bite of his steak and chewed slowly. He took a sip of water and set his glass down hard. "It is overcooked, Valerie," he snapped. "I asked for medium rare. This is practically medium well. Are you incapable of following simple instructions?" I looked at the perfectly pink center of his meat. It was exactly what he asked for. He just wanted a reason to demean me. "I am sorry, Trevor," I replied quietly. "I will do better next time." He waved his hand, dismissing me completely. "Just go clean up the kitchen," he ordered. "We have important family matters to discuss, and we do not need you lingering around." I turned around and walked back into the kitchen. I washed their dirty pots and pans. I scrubbed the marble counters until they shined. I played the obedient servant flawlessly. When I was finally finished, I walked down the dark, narrow stairs to the basement. The air was damp and cold. There was a small, folding cot pushed against the concrete wall just like Trevor had promised. But right next to the cot, hidden behind a false panel, was the glowing blue light of the estate server rack. I sat down on the uncomfortable bed and pulled out my laptop. The humiliation of the day washed over me, but it did not break me. It fueled me. I opened the financial monitoring software. Trevor had already begun attempting to transfer small amounts of money from the liquid accounts into his brokerage firm. The system had flagged every single attempt. He was eager and reckless. I smiled in the dark basement, listening to the faint sound of my family laughing upstairs. They were celebrating their victory. They were feasting on the food I prepared, sitting in the chairs my husband bought. Let them laugh. The dinner they just ate would be one of the last peaceful meals they would ever have. The next evening, Trevor hosted what he called a casual strategy session. In reality, it was just an excuse for him to parade his new wealth in front of his business associates. 3 men arrived in luxury cars, stepping onto my driveway like they owned the neighborhood. They were older white men dressed in golf shirts and expensive loafers. Trevor greeted them at the door with a loud, booming laugh, shaking their hands with excessive enthusiasm. "Welcome, gentlemen," he declared, sweeping his arm toward the interior of my home. "Not bad for a quick acquisition, right?" I stood in the hallway holding a tray of crystal glasses. The sight of him playing Lord of the Manor made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression blank. Jasmine was lounging on the sofa pretending to read a fashion magazine. She looked up only to offer a practiced, tight smile to the guests. My parents were nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in their suite to avoid acknowledging my new role as the household servant. Trevor clapped his hands together, rubbing them briskly. "Valerie, bring the scotch!" he barked, not even looking in my direction. "The good stuff, Julian Reserve." I walked into the living room, the tray heavy in my hands. The men barely glanced at me, continuing their loud conversation about golf courses and property taxes. I carefully poured the amber liquid into each glass, handing them out one by one. A man with thinning silver hair and a ruddy face took his glass and nodded toward me. "Nice of you to help out," he mumbled dismissively. Trevor let out a condescending chuckle. "Oh, she is not just helping out Tom. She is my sister-in-law, Valerie. Poor thing lost her husband recently. Julian, great guy, but terrible at estate planning. Left everything in a complete mess. I had to step in and save her from herself. The grief really took a toll on her mental state." The men exchanged sympathetic glances, nodding solemnly. "Such a shame," Tom said, taking a sip of the scotch. "Good thing she has family to look after her." "Yes," Trevor agreed, puffing out his chest. "It was a close call. She was completely unstable, ready to just hand the entire $7.5 million estate over to some shady charity. I had to secure emergency conservatorship just to protect the assets. It is a heavy burden, but family comes first." I stood there silently absorbing every lie. He was spinning a narrative that made him look like a hero while erasing my entire existence. I slowly backed away, blending into the background of my own living room. Jasmine flipped a page in her magazine, looking utterly bored by the conversation. I retreated to the kitchen, leaning against the marble island. The anger inside me was a cold, hard knot. But I needed more than anger, I needed proof. I took my phone out of my pocket and tapped the voice memo app. The red circle glowed, indicating it was recording. I quietly walked back toward the living room, stopping just out of sight behind the large archway. The men were deep in conversation, their voices low and conspiratorial. Trevor was leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So, Tom, about the capital injection for the firm?" Trevor said, his voice dropping a full octave. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You have been promising a turnaround for months, Trevor. Your brokerage is bleeding cash. The board is getting restless." Trevor smiled a sly, confident smirk. "That is exactly why I invited you here tonight. The liquidity issue is solved. I am currently in the process of rolling the entire $7.5 million from the estate into the firm accounts. It is completely legal under the conservatorship umbrella. I have full discretionary power over the assets. I can leverage the entire amount to stabilize the brokerage and fund the new commercial developments." The third man, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "You are sure the conservatorship is airtight? No chance the widow decides to contest it?" Trevor laughed a sharp, cruel sound. "Valerie contest it. Please. She does not have the spine or the brain to fight back. She thinks Julian money is just sitting in a checking account somewhere. She has no idea how corporate structures work. Besides, my mother-in-law has her completely convinced she is losing her mind. It is a flawless setup. The firm gets the capital injection, and I get full control of the estate. Everybody wins, except the widow, of course, but she will be well taken care of in the basement." The men chuckled, raising their glasses in a toast. "To new capital," Tom said. "To family," Trevor replied, clinking his glass against theirs. I stood perfectly still behind the archway, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. The recording app captured every single word. He had just confessed to a massive financial crime right in my living room. He was planning to embezzle the entire estate to save his failing business. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. I pressed stop on the recording and slid the phone back into my pocket. A slow smile spread across my face. Trevor was right about one thing. I did not know how his brokerage worked, but I knew exactly how Julian Holding Company worked. And Trevor was about to find out that he had not absorbed an asset, he had swallowed a poison pill. I turned around and walked quietly back to the kitchen. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and all I had to do now was wait for the poison to take effect. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, echoing through the quiet house. Trevor and his business partners had finally finished their cigars and expensive scotch. I heard the low murmur of Trevor and Jasmine walking up the grand staircase to the master bedroom, complaining about how exhausting it was to entertain. I was standing at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water run over my hands. I was washing the crystal glasses they had left scattered across the living room. The house was completely silent except for the sound of the running water and the distant crashing of the ocean waves outside. Then I heard the sharp click of designer heels against the hardwood floor. I did not have to turn around to know it was my mother. Vivian leaned against the marble island, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. She watched me scrub a glass for a long time before she finally spoke. "You look exactly where you belong, Valerie," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty. "Right at the sink, cleaning up our messes." I kept my eyes focused on the soapy water slowly rinsing the glass. I did not take the bait. My silence only seemed to agitate her more. She took a step closer, her expensive perfume filling the kitchen and overpowering the smell of the ocean breeze. "You always were so stubborn," she continued, letting out a harsh little laugh. "Just like your grandmother. Nana was always perfectly content living in the dirt counting pennies, and you were just the same. When your father and I finally started making real money, when we finally got the chance to move out of that neighborhood and join the country club, we knew we could not take you with us." I placed the clean glass on the drying rack and turned off the faucet. I slowly turned around and leaned against the counter facing her. My face was an unreadable mask. "Why is that, Mother?" I asked softly, keeping my voice completely monotone. Vivian's eyes flashed with a toxic pride. She wanted to say this. She had wanted to say this for 18 years. "Because you did not fit the image, Valerie," she spat out, stepping right up to me. "Look at you. Look at your skin. Look at your hair. You were too dark, too loud, too rough around the edges. You did not look like you belonged in a gated community. You looked like you belonged exactly where we left you in the projects." Jasmine, on the other hand, Jasmine was perfect. She had the right look, the right complexion, the right manners. She was light enough and pretty enough to be accepted by the people who mattered, people like Trevor and his country club friends. We had to make a choice, Valerie. We could either drag you along and let you ruin our social standing, or we could leave you behind and build an empire. We chose the empire. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. It was surreal to hear a mother speak about her own child with such calculated venom. The colorism, the classism, the deep-seated self-hatred she had projected onto me, it was all out in the open now. There was no pretending anymore. "You left a 16-year-old girl behind because she was not light-skinned enough for your new rich friends," I stated simply, repeating her logic back to her. Vivian did not even flinch. She lifted her chin, looking down her nose at me. "I made a sacrifice for the greater good of this family," she declared proudly. "And look how right I was. Jasmine married a wealthy broker. She lives the life we designed for her. And what did you do? You married a man who croaked and left you helpless. You spent your life digging through dead people trash as an estate liquidator. And now you are right back under my thumb, sleeping in a damp basement and washing my dishes. The universe always corrects itself, Valerie. You are exactly where you were always meant to be, at the bottom, serving us." My chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic breath. For a brief second, the 16-year-old girl inside me wanted to scream. She wanted to cry and ask why she was never enough. But the 34-year-old woman I had become simply looked at Vivian with profound pity. She was a hollow, empty shell of a human being, chasing the approval of people who would never truly respect her. I reached for a towel and slowly dried my hands. I folded the towel neatly and placed it on the counter. "Are you done, Mother?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with a chilling calm. "Make sure you sleep well tonight." Vivian's face contorted in pure rage. She expected me to break down. She wanted tears. She wanted me to beg for her love or scream in agony. My absolute indifference infuriated her. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she hissed. She reached out and slapped my hand hard. The sharp smack echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. A bright red mark instantly bloomed across the back of my hand. "You are nothing," she snarled, pointing a manicured finger an inch from my face. "You own nothing. You are nothing. Trevor controls every dime of Julian money, and we control Trevor. You will live in that basement, and you will do exactly as you are told until the day you die, or until we decide to throw you out on the street again. Do you understand me?" I looked down at my stinging hand and then back up into her furious eyes. I did not rub the red mark. I did not step back. I just smiled. It was a small, cold smile that did not reach my eyes. "I understand perfectly, Mother," I said. Vivian glared at me for one more long second, trying to decipher my expression. Finding nothing but ice, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen. Her heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway as she retreated to her luxurious guest suite. The door slammed shut, rattling the picture frames on the walls. I stood alone in the dark kitchen, the silence rushing back in to fill the space she had left behind. I looked out the window at the dark ocean, listening to the waves crash against the shore. Vivian thought she had just delivered the final crushing blow to my spirit. She thought she had cemented her victory and proven her superiority once and for all. She was completely unaware that she was a passenger on a sinking ship. She was entirely ignorant of the massive financial trap that had already been triggered in the basement directly beneath her feet. I turned off the kitchen lights and walked slowly toward the basement door. The physical sting on my hand was already fading, replaced by a deep, satisfying anticipation. Tomorrow the illusion they had built would shatter. Tomorrow the money they thought they stole would become the very chains that would drag them down to the bottom of the ocean. I walked down the wooden stairs to my cot in the dark. The blue light of the server rack blinked steadily in the corner, a silent countdown to their absolute destruction. I lay down on the thin mattress and closed my eyes, resting peacefully for the first time since Julian died. My mother told me to sleep well, and for the first time in my life, I was actually going to take her advice. I slept for exactly 3 hours. At 2 in the morning, my eyes snapped open in the pitch-black basement. The air was cool and still. The house above me was completely dead quiet, except for the faint sound of the ocean waves crashing outside. It was time. My mother had told me to sleep well, and I had. My mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. The grief for Julian was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was now entirely focused into a cold, sharp purpose. I slipped out from under the thin wool blanket and stood up. My bare feet touched the cold concrete floor. I crept silently up the narrow wooden stairs, moving like a ghost in my own home. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening intently. From the guest suite on the first floor, I could hear the heavy rhythmic snoring of my father Roland. From the master bedroom upstairs, there was absolute silence. Trevor and Jasmine were fast asleep, dreaming of the empire they thought they had just conquered. I bypassed the kitchen and walked down the long, dark hallway toward Julian's locked home office. Trevor had proudly claimed this room for his real estate calls earlier that day. He had sat in Julian's leather chair and put his feet up on the desk, acting like he owned the entire world. But Trevor was too arrogant and far too careless to realize that the heavy mahogany desk was custom built. It had a hidden biometric drawer that only responded to my fingerprints and Julian fingerprints. I stepped into the office and closed the door silently behind me. The room still smelled faintly of Julian's favorite coffee and old paper. I walked over to the desk and ran my hand along the smooth wood. I reached underneath, feeling for the small indentation. I pressed my thumb against the concealed scanner. A soft mechanical click echoed in the silent room. I pulled the heavy drawer open and lifted out Julian's True Master laptop. The terminal I had set up in the basement was just a monitoring node. This machine was the real brain of Julian and Val Holdings. I set it on the desk and opened the lid. The screen glowed to life, casting a pale blue light across my face in the dark room. I logged into the main dashboard, navigating through layers of military-grade encryption. The secure network immediately displayed the legal framework of the emergency conservatorship Trevor had filed. I read through the documents line by line. Trevor was so utterly blinded by the sight of $7.5 million that he completely ignored the fine print of our corporate structure. By aggressively rushing to claim legal guardianship over my estate and declaring me mentally unfit, Trevor had formally and legally merged his personal and business liabilities with my private holding company. He thought he had found a brilliant loophole to absorb my wealth and save his failing business. Instead, he had legally authorized me to absorb all of his debts. My eyes scanned the raw financial data, pulling up the full credit reports of everyone sleeping in the house. It was worse than I had even imagined. Trevor's massive real estate brokerage firm was drowning in over $2 million of toxic commercial mortgages. He had leveraged everything he owned, and he was weeks away from total bankruptcy. Jasmine, my perfect golden child sister, had maxed out 4 different platinum credit cards to the tune of $80,000 just to maintain her fake wealthy lifestyle on social media. And my parents, Vivian and Roland. The people who threw me away for not fitting into their high society image were 3 months behind on the mortgage of their pristine suburban mansion. They were all drowning. They were all living on borrowed time and stolen money, masking their massive failures behind designer clothes and arrogant attitudes. I navigated to the master control panel of the holding company. I selected the specific legal clause Trevor had signed and cross-referenced it with our corporate debt acquisition protocols. Julian had designed this system specifically to protect me from predators. He knew my family might come circling if anything ever happened to him. He had built a financial fortress that looked exactly like a vault of cash from the outside, but was actually a legally binding trap. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This was the moment of no return. 18 years of being the family scapegoat. 18 years of being told I was worthless, ugly, and unlovable all came down to a single keystroke. My mother. Cruel words from the kitchen echoed in my mind. She had said I was exactly where I belonged at the bottom serving them. I took a deep breath and typed the final command. Execute debt acquisition. I pressed enter. The screen froze for a fraction of a second, analyzing the massive transfer of data. Then the entire dashboard flashed a brilliant solid green. A small notification popped up in the center of the screen, confirming the legal transfer of all their outstanding liabilities directly into Julian and Val Holdings. The trap was officially set. The jaws had snapped shut completely, severing their financial lifelines. The bank no longer owned their mortgages, and the credit card companies no longer owned their debt. I did. I was no longer just the grieving widow they had forced into the damp basement to wash their dishes. I was now the sole exclusive owner of every single debt my family owed. I held their entire financial existence in the palm of my hand. I closed the laptop and the room plunged back into complete darkness. I slipped the computer back into the hidden drawer and pushed it shut until I heard the biometric lock engage. I walked back down the hallway to the basement, my heart beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. I lay back down on the uncomfortable cot, but I did not feel small or defeated. I felt incredibly powerful. They would wake up tomorrow morning demanding breakfast and acting like royalty. They would order me around and insult my dead husband. They had absolutely no idea that they were already completely bankrupt. Their empire was gone, and they were entirely at my mercy. A week passed since that night in the basement. My family had completely settled into their delusion of grandeur. To solidify their new status, my mother Vivian decided to throw a massive family cookout on the back lawn of my beach house. She invited every extended family member she could find, and half the congregation from her high society church. The catering trucks arrived early in the morning, unloading mountains of expensive seafood and premium cuts of meat. Vivian walked around the manicured grass, pointing her manicured fingers and barking orders at the hired staff. She wanted everyone to see how far she had come. She wanted them to see the sprawling ocean views and the massive deck, and believe it was all hers by right. Jasmine made her grand entrance hours after the setup began. She stepped onto the patio wearing a $5,000 designer sundress that she had absolutely bought on one of her maxed-out platinum credit cards. She posed for photos with her church friends, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She laughed loudly, making sure everyone noticed her expensive jewelry. The irony was incredibly sweet. She was wearing a dress she could not afford while standing on property she did not own, celebrating wealth that was already entirely mine. I stayed out of the way, playing my role to absolute perfection. I wore a faded gray oversized t-shirt and a pair of old jeans. My hair was pulled back into a messy bun. I looked exactly the way they wanted me to look, broken, defeated, and completely out of my mind with grief. Trevor had told everyone that cooking was therapeutic for me. So there I was, standing over the hot grill, flipping burgers in the sweltering heat, while my family entertained their guests in the shade of the luxury cabanas. I could hear the whispers as the guests mingled on the lawn. Aunts and uncles I had not seen in almost 2 decades walked past me, casting pitiful glances in my direction. "Aunt Valerie, poor thing," I heard a cousin whisper to his wife. "Vivian says she completely lost her mind after Julian died." "It is a blessing." Trevor stepped in to handle the money, or she would have ended up on the street. His wife shook her head, taking a sip of her mimosa. "Such a tragedy," she replied. "She always was the strange one in the family. At least Vivian and Roland have such a beautiful home to take care of her in now." I flipped another burger, pressing the spatula down into the meat. The sizzle of the grease drowned out their toxic gossip. They were all buying into the fake image my mother had so carefully constructed. They looked at my family and saw success, wealth, and generosity. They looked at me and saw a tragic charity case. But I knew the truth. I knew that every single bite of food they were eating, every drop of alcohol they were drinking, and every blade of grass they were standing on belonged to me. Vivian strolled over to the grill holding a plate of expensive appetizers. She did not look at me directly. Instead, she looked out at the crowd of people admiring her. "Make sure those are cooked all the way through, Valerie," she instructed, her voice laced with fake sweetness for the benefit of anyone listening nearby. "Pastor Thomas prefers his meat well done. We want everything to be absolutely perfect today. This is our official introduction to the neighborhood." I stared at the side of her face, noting the deep lines of stress hiding beneath her heavy makeup. "Yes, Mother," I said quietly, keeping my eyes downcast. "Everything will be perfect." She smiled a tight, self-satisfied smile and walked away to greet another group of guests. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She introduced Trevor as the brilliant financial mind who had saved the family from ruin. She introduced Jasmine as her beautiful, successful daughter. And she introduced the beach house as the realization of all their hard work and sacrifice. I watched Trevor from across the lawn. He was holding court with a group of older men from the church, boasting loudly about his upcoming real estate ventures. He was drinking heavily, his face flushed with arrogance. He had no idea that the bank had already flagged his accounts. He had no idea that the debt acquisition I triggered a week ago was silently working its way through the financial system, wrapping around his neck like an invisible noose. A sudden gust of wind blew across the lawn, carrying the salty smell of the ocean. The expensive paper lanterns Vivian had hung from the patio cover swayed violently. I took a deep breath, feeling the heat of the grill against my skin. The charade was exhausting, but it was also incredibly entertaining. They were throwing a party on the edge of a cliff, and none of them realized the ground was already crumbling beneath their feet. I loaded a platter with cooked burgers and walked toward the buffet table. A few church members stepped back as I approached, giving me wide, sympathetic smiles. I set the heavy tray down and wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. "Thank you, dear," one older woman said, patting my arm awkwardly. "It is so good that you are keeping busy. Grief is a terrible thing." I looked at the woman and offered a weak, trembling smile. "Thank you," I whispered, playing the part of the fragile widow perfectly. "My family has been very supportive." The woman nodded approvingly and walked away to tell the others how brave I was being. I walked back to the grill, picking up my spatula. The party raged on around me, a symphony of fake laughter and hollow praise. My family was putting on a masterclass in deception, but they were amateur actors performing on my stage. I let them have their moment in the sun. I let them bask in the false admiration of their peers. Because I knew that the sun was setting, and when the darkness finally came, they would have nowhere left to hide. The grill sizzled as I placed another piece of meat on the grates. The countdown was almost over. The afternoon dragged on, and the intense heat radiating from the grill began to make the back of my neck sweat. I was arranging a new row of hot dogs when I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see Aunt Clara standing there. She was my father, older sister, a woman who had always prided herself on being the family historian and the primary source of all neighborhood gossip. She looked at me with an expression that was halfway between genuine pity and morbid curiosity. "Valerie, sweetheart," she cooed, leaning in close so the other guests would not hear. "We are all just so worried about you. How are you managing without Julian and the money? I heard rumors that his estate was quite substantial." Before I could even open my mouth to respond, Jasmine materialized out of nowhere. She practically shoved Aunt Clara aside, clutching her crystal glass of sparkling water with a tight grip. "Oh, Aunt Clara, it is a tragedy," Jasmine announced, her voice unnaturally loud, ensuring that at least 3 other groups of relatives could hear her perfectly. "Valerie is completely lost. She almost gave Julian entire life savings to some online scammers who promised to build orphanages overseas. It was a complete mental breakdown." She paused, letting the dramatic lie settle over the crowd that had slowly started to gather. "We were terrified she was going to lose everything." Jasmine continued, sighing heavily and placing a hand over her heart. "Thank God Trevor stepped in to save her. He had to go to court and get full conservatorship just to protect her from herself. She is simply not capable of handling her own affairs right now." Aunt Clara gasped, pressing a hand to her cheek. "Oh my Lord, Valerie, is that true?" I looked at Jasmine, absorbing the absolute audacity of her lies. She was so deeply invested in the narrative she had created that I think she actually believed it. Trevor, who had been holding court near the patio, suddenly noticed the crowd gathering and sauntered over. He draped a heavy arm over Jasmine's shoulder and beamed at Aunt Clara. "It is true, Clara," he said, his voice booming with arrogant authority. "It was a messy situation, but family has to step up when someone is clearly failing. We are just making sure Valerie is taken care of." He reached out and patted me on the top of my head twice like I was a stray dog he had begrudgingly decided to feed. "Good girl," he mumbled condescendingly, before turning back to the crowd. I stood perfectly still, staring at the man who had just stolen my life, and was now publicly humiliating me for sport. The anger that had been simmering inside me for the past week suddenly crystallized into something entirely cold and precise. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, checking the time. It was exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. I looked up from the screen and locked eyes with Trevor. "It is funny how money works, Trevor," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter of the crowd. It was not loud, but it carried a weight that made a few people stop and turn around. Trevor paused, his fake smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone suddenly defensive. I stepped away from the grill, wiping my hands on my old jeans. "I said it is funny how money works," I repeated, speaking slowly and clearly so everyone could hear. "It has a way of disappearing completely when you do not actually own it." A heavy silence fell over our small group. Aunt Clara looked confused. Jasmine frowned, her grip tightening on her glass. Trevor let out a short, nervous laugh, attempting to brush off the comment. "Well, Valerie, that is exactly why you need me managing it," he said loudly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You do not understand the first thing about capital or asset protection." I smiled. It was not the weak, trembling smile I had been wearing all afternoon. It was a sharp, predatory smile. "You are absolutely right, Trevor," I replied, my voice dripping with ice. "I do not understand capital at all. But Julian did. And he always said that a fool and his money are soon parted, especially when the fool tries to steal money that was never his to begin with." Trevor's face darkened. He took a step toward me, his arrogant facade cracking to reveal the bully underneath. "What the hell are you talking about?" he hissed, keeping his voice low so the other guests would not hear. "Are you having another episode, Valerie? Because I can have you sent back to the basement right now." Before I could answer, a loud mechanical buzz interrupted the tense silence. It was not my phone. It was Trevor's phone vibrating violently in his suit pocket. He ignored it, keeping his angry eyes fixed on me. "You better watch your mouth, Valerie," he threatened, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. The phone buzzed again, louder this time. Then Jasmine's phone began to ring from inside her designer purse. She dug it out, checking the screen with an annoyed sigh. "It is the caterer," she said, waving the phone at Trevor. "They are probably just asking about the setup for dessert. I will handle it." She answered the call, putting on her sweetest voice. "Hello, yes, this is Jasmine." Trevor's phone buzzed a third time. I nodded toward his pocket. "You should probably answer that, Trevor," I suggested casually. "It might be important." He glared at me, pulling the phone out and glaring at the screen. His face instantly drained of all color. The smug arrogance vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He stared at the glowing screen, reading the message over and over again, as if hoping the words would magically change. Jasmine's voice suddenly dropped an octave. "What do you mean the card declined?" she demanded, her sweet tone replaced by sharp panic. "Try it again. It is a platinum account. There must be a mistake." She pulled the phone away from her ear, frantically tapping the screen. She looked up at Trevor, her eyes wide with confusion. "Trevor, they are saying my card declined for the final catering payment." The crowd around us had gone completely silent now, watching the perfect image of my family begin to crack and splinter right before their eyes. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on me was slowly turning back on them, and they had absolutely no idea how to stop it. I stood quietly by the grill, watching the panic set in. The poison pill Julian had designed was finally working its way through their financial veins. The show was just getting started. I watched Jasmine tap the screen of her expensive phone repeatedly, her perfect manicure clicking loudly against the glass. Trevor was still staring at his own screen, his face a mask of sudden pale horror. The head caterer, a tall man in a crisp white uniform, approached Jasmine carrying a black leather portfolio. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, clearing his throat. "The catering company requires the final balance for the seafood tower before we can begin serving the lobster tails. It comes out to $4,200. Jasmine forced a laugh that sounded thin and shrill. "Oh, of course," she said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "It is just a small glitch with my primary card." She unzipped her designer clutch and pulled out a different platinum card, sliding it confidently toward the caterer. "Use this one," she ordered. "It has a much higher limit anyway." The caterer nodded, taking the card and stepping over to a portable payment terminal sitting on the edge of the buffet table. He inserted the card, the machine beeping as it processed the transaction. The small crowd of relatives had gone completely silent, now their eyes darting between Jasmine and the caterer. The machine beeped again, a long, flat sound. The caterer frowned, looking at the printed receipt. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice slightly louder this time. "This card was also declined. The system says the account has been suspended by the issuer." Jasmine's face turned a blotchy red. "That is impossible," she snapped, snatching the card back. "Do you know who my husband is? Our accounts are perfectly fine. Your little machine must be broken. Try it again." The caterer sighed, looking uncomfortable. "I can try it one more time, but if it declines again, we will have to stop the food service until another form of payment is provided." Trevor, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly snapped out of his trance. He shoved past Jasmine, grabbing the caterer by the arm. "Forget her cards!" he barked, his voice laced with pure panic. "Use mine!" He pulled a heavy black corporate card from his wallet and slammed it onto the terminal. "I am the managing director of a multi-million-dollar brokerage firm," he announced to the crowd, trying desperately to maintain his image of wealth. "This card has no limit. Process it now." The caterer picked up the black card and inserted it into the machine. Everyone held their breath. 10 agonizing seconds passed. The terminal beeped its long, flat tone of rejection. The caterer pulled the card out slowly, looking at Trevor with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Sir, this account has a hard freeze placed on it. It says contact your financial institution immediately regarding a massive debt acquisition block." Trevor snatched the card out of the caterer's hand, his chest heaving. "This is a mistake," he yelled, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "A massive mistake." He pulled out his phone again, dialing a number with shaking fingers. He put it on speaker, pacing back and forth on the manicured lawn, completely forgetting about the audience of family and church members watching him. "Welcome to Premier Corporate Banking," the automated voice announced. "Please hold for a representative." Trevor cursed loudly, causing Aunt Clara to cover her mouth in shock. "Pick up the phone," he muttered angrily. A live agent finally answered. "This is Sarah. How can I help you?" Trevor stopped pacing, practically screaming into the phone. "My name is Trevor, and all of my corporate accounts are frozen. I have a caterer standing right in front of me trying to charge $4,000 and my black card was declined. Fix it right now." There was a pause on the line. "Sir, please remain calm. Let me pull up your file." Another long, agonizing pause. "Sir, I am looking at your accounts now. All of your assets, including your personal credit lines and your corporate holding accounts, have been automatically frozen due to a superseding debt acquisition execution. Your accounts show a negative balance of $2.4 million as of 3 a.m. this morning." Trevor dropped the phone, letting it fall onto the soft grass. The speakerphone was still active, the customer service representative voice echoing across the lawn. "Sir, are you still there, sir? You have 24 hours to contact the primary lien holder before the foreclosure process begins on all your registered properties." Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, dropping her crystal glass onto the patio. It shattered into pieces, sending water and ice flying everywhere. "Trevor! $2 million!" she shrieked, her voice echoing over the silent crowd. "You told me the firm was fine. You told me rolling Valerie money over would solve everything." Trevor spun around, pointing a trembling finger at me. "It is her!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "She did this. I do not know how, but she locked me out. She trapped me." The relatives began whispering furiously among themselves, the perfect illusion of my mother, wealthy, powerful family completely shattering before their eyes. Vivian pushed her way through the crowd, her face white as a sheet. "Trevor, lower your voice," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "You are making a scene in front of Pastor Thomas." Trevor yanked his arm away. "Forget the pastor, Vivian," he yelled. "We are broke. The firm is gone. The credit cards are maxed out. We do not even own the cars we drove here in." I stood by the grill, calmly flipping the last burger. The chaos was beautiful to watch. The caterer slowly packed up the payment terminal, looking at Jasmine. "So about the lobster?" he asked quietly. Jasmine burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. The party was officially over. The trap had finally snapped entirely shut. The caterer stood awkwardly holding the useless payment terminal while Jasmine sobbed into her hands, covering her face to hide her tears from the crowd. Trevor was still staring at his frozen phone screen, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated panic. The murmurs of the church members and extended family grew louder, turning into a chorus of harsh whispers that buzzed like angry bees across the lawn. Vivian tried desperately to corral everyone toward the luxury cabanas, forcing a tight plastic smile and insisting loudly that it was just a minor banking error and the food would be served shortly. But before anyone could move, a heavy, unsettling silence rippled from the front of the house, all the way to the back patio. The smooth jazz playing from the outdoor speakers was abruptly cut off, leaving only the sound of the crashing ocean waves. Two men walked onto the manicured grass. They were not dressed for a summer cookout. They wore sharp dark suits, crisp white shirts, and dark sunglasses. They moved with a synchronized, rigid authority that made the wealthy guests naturally part ways to let them through. The taller of the two men reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a bright gold badge. The afternoon sun caught the metal blindingly bright, confirming every terrible fear my family had. "We are looking for Trevor and Roland," the tall man announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the completely silent lawn. My father, Roland, who had been hiding near the outdoor bar, trying to avoid the credit card humiliation, suddenly froze. He clutched his crystal glass, his hands shaking so violently the ice rattled against the sides. Trevor swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step backward as if he could somehow blend into the crowd of relatives who were already stepping away from him. "I am Trevor," he managed to croak out, his voice completely stripped of its usual booming arrogance. "What is this about?" The second agent, a stocky man with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward, holding a thick manila envelope. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents stapled together with thick red tape. "We are special agents with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," he stated flatly. "We have court-ordered documentation here regarding the Julian and Val Holdings corporate structure." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. Aunt Clara clutched her chest, sinking heavily into one of the expensive patio chairs and fanning herself. Vivian rushed forward, stepping frantically between her husband and the federal agents, her eyes wide with desperation. "There must be some kind of terrible misunderstanding," officers, Vivian pleaded, her voice trembling as she tried to maintain her perfect socialite persona. "My husband and my son-in-law are upstanding members of the community. We were just hosting a private family gathering to celebrate my daughter stepping into her inheritance." The tall agent looked at Vivian with absolute cold indifference. "There is no misunderstanding, ma'am. According to the emergency conservatorship filings submitted and approved by a federal judge last week, Trevor and Roland petitioned for and were granted full legal financial guardianship over the estate of the deceased." "Yes," Trevor interrupted, his voice cracking in panic. "Yes, we did that to protect the assets. My sister-in-law is mentally unstable. That is all we did. We were protecting the money." The agent shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure professional pity. When you aggressively bypassed standard probate law to seize the assets immediately, you also bypassed all liability shields. When you claimed full guardianship over a corporate holding entity, you did not just claim the liquid cash. You legally assumed total liability for all structured corporate debt and the associated federal tax burdens attached to that entity. Mr. Trevor, your personal real estate brokerage was legally linked to the estate as a guarantor the moment you signed those papers. Trevor's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. "What does that actually mean?" he whispered, his eyes darting frantically between the two agents. "It means," the stocky agent said, pulling a specific piece of paper from the stack and reading from it, that your brokerage firm had $2.4 million in toxic commercial debt. When you forced the merger of your accounts with the holding company, the estate system automatically triggered a massive debt acquisition protocol. Your failing firm was completely swallowed by the estate. And because your firm had been evading federal corporate taxes for 3 consecutive years, the Internal Revenue Service was immediately notified of the transfer. We have placed a federal tax lien on all connected assets to cover the delinquency. Roland dropped his glass. It shattered violently against the stone patio, sending shards of crystal everywhere, but no one even jumped. The silence on the lawn was suffocating. Roland had spent his entire life building a respectable facade, throwing his own teenage daughter away just to maintain his image, and now he was watching it vaporize in an instant. "I do not understand," Roland stammered, looking helplessly at Trevor and then at the federal agents. "I just signed the paper to help manage the beachfront property. I do not own his real estate business. I am just a retired banker." "You signed as a legal co-guardian?" the stocky agent clarified, handing the heavy stack of papers directly to Trevor. "Which makes you jointly and severally liable. As of 3 o'clock this morning, the Internal Revenue Service has frozen all accounts associated with your Social Security numbers. This includes your primary suburban residence, your luxury vehicles, and any remaining liquid capital. You are officially under federal investigation for massive tax evasion and fraudulent asset acquisition." The words hung in the warm summer air, heavy and absolute. Fraudulent asset acquisition. They had tried to steal a $7.5 million fortune under the guise of fake family concern, and instead they had legally volunteered to take the fall for a massive catastrophic financial collapse. Jasmine let out a piercing wail, sinking to her knees on the expensive patio stone, completely ruining her designer dress. She clawed at Trevor's legs, screaming at him, demanding to know how he could do this to her and where her money went. Vivian leaned heavily against the outdoor bar, looking like she might pass out right there on the grass. All her high society church friends, all the people she had tried so hard to impress for 18 years, were watching her family be publicly dismantled and humiliated by federal agents. Trevor looked down at the official documents in his trembling hands. His eyes scanned the bold black ink, reading the exact same corporate clauses I had read in the dark basement a week ago. The devastating realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He realized he had not outsmarted anyone. He had walked directly into a meticulously designed trap and locked the door behind himself. He slowly lifted his head, looking past the federal agents, past his sobbing wife, and locked eyes with me. I was still standing by the grill, perfectly calm. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I just held his gaze and watched him realize that the broken, helpless widow he had shoved into a basement and treated like a servant was actually the architect of his total and absolute destruction. The unexpected guests had delivered the final notice, but the eviction was entirely my design. Trevor could not stand the burning stares of the church members and extended family any longer. He shoved the heavy stack of federal documents into his chest and grabbed the tall agent by the sleeve of his dark suit. "We need to take this inside," he demanded, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of rage and sheer terror. "We are not doing this out here on the lawn in front of everyone." The tall agent firmly removed Trevor's shaking hand from his suit sleeve, adjusting his cuff with calm precision. He nodded slowly, gesturing toward the open glass doors of the patio. "Lead the way, Mr. Trevor," the agent said, his voice dripping with cold, professional authority. Trevor practically ran across the patio, leaving the ruined cookout and his sobbing wife behind. Roland stumbled after him, his face still completely ashen, his breathing shallow and rapid, like a man having a heart attack. I followed them quietly, slipping through the sliding glass doors and leaning casually against the doorframe. I wanted a front-row seat to the absolute dismantling of their fake empire. The living room was still meticulously decorated with the expensive art and luxury furniture my mother had been bragging about all afternoon. But the warm sunlight pouring through the large windows did not make the room feel inviting anymore. Right now, the sprawling living room just looked like a very expensive holding cell for 2 incredibly guilty men. Trevor threw the stack of papers onto the large glass coffee table. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "This makes no sense," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the documents. The estate was valued at $7.5 million. I saw the initial valuations from the attorneys. I saw the asset lists. Where is the liquid cash? Where are the standard banking accounts? You cannot just freeze my entire business because of a bureaucratic technicality. The stocky agent stepped forward calmly, opening his own manila folder and pulling out a detailed financial ledger. "Mr. Trevor, there is no liquid cash sitting in a standard checking account waiting for you to spend it," the agent explained, speaking slowly as if addressing a highly delusional child. Julian and Val Holdings is a complex corporate structure. The $7.5 million valuation was based entirely on a portfolio of leveraged assets, corporate acquisitions, and active debt purchasing contracts. Trevor stared at the agent, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the devastating reality began to penetrate his thick skull. "But the money," he stammered, taking a step back. "I filed the emergency conservatorship to manage the money. I am her legal guardian." The tall agent stepped closer, his tone brutally professional and completely devoid of sympathy. "When you executed that emergency conservatorship, bypassing all standard probate courts and waiting periods, you aggressively merged your personal financial identity with a high-risk corporate entity." Julian and Val Holdings was currently undergoing a massive scheduled corporate tax audit. A standard estate executor would have been legally shielded by a corporate veil. But you did not file as a standard executor, did you? You filed a hostile financial guardianship claiming the widow was mentally incompetent, forcefully assuming direct personal liability for everything attached to her name. Roland sank heavily into one of the plush velvet armchairs, burying his face in his trembling hands. "We only did it because we thought she was going to give the money away to charity," he whimpered, his voice pathetic and weak. "We were just trying to protect the family legacy." The tall agent looked down at my father with absolute disdain. "What you did, Mr. Roland, was legally tie your personal social security number to a corporate entity that was holding massive leverage. And because Trevor Real Estate Brokerage was severely underwater and facing bankruptcy, the holding company automatically executed a hostile debt takeover program. You are now personally responsible for the back taxes of a failing real estate firm and the massive audit penalties of a corporate holding company." Trevor grabbed his own hair, pulling at the perfectly styled strands until his scalp turned bright red. "This is a setup!" he screamed, pacing the length of the living room like a caged animal. "This is a complete fraud. I am going to call my lawyers right now. I am going to sue the estate, and I am going to sue the federal government." The stocky agent closed his folder with a sharp final snap. "You can call whoever you want, Mr. Trevor. But your lawyers require heavy retainers, and as of 3 o'clock this morning, you do not have a single cent to your name. The Internal Revenue Service has officially placed a federal tax lien on your suburban home. Your luxury vehicles have already been flagged for repossession. Your business accounts, your personal checking accounts, and your wife credit cards are entirely frozen." Trevor stopped pacing his chest, heaving violently as he gasped for air. "My house," he whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "You are taking my house." The tall agent corrected him immediately, without a shred of pity. "We are not taking it, Mr. Trevor. The bank is taking it. Because your firm defaulted on its commercial loans the second the accounts were frozen, the bank has initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. You have essentially evicted yourself from your own life." I stood quietly in the doorway, listening to the beautiful sound of their absolute destruction. The room was echoing with the catastrophic consequences of their own boundless greed. Trevor had always thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought his arrogant privilege and his slick business jargon made him untouchable. He thought a black woman from the projects could never outsmart him. And yet here he was, entirely stripped of his wealth, his fake status, and his stolen power in less than 10 minutes. Roland looked up from his hands, his eyes bloodshot and watering. "What about my house?" he asked, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "What about my pension accounts?" The stocky agent did not even blink. "As a co-signer on the fraudulent guardianship filings, your personal assets are subject to the exact same federal liens. Your suburban home is currently under review for immediate seizure to cover the joint tax liabilities. I strongly suggest you and your wife begin packing your belongings, Mr. Rowland." Trevor let out a guttural, animalistic scream and kicked the heavy glass coffee table. The thick glass cracked violently down the middle, creating a perfect physical representation of his shattered existence. "This is illegal," he roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "She tricked me. Valerie tricked me into signing those papers." He pointed an accusing finger at me across the room, his eyes wild and utterly desperate. The two federal agents slowly turned to look at me, standing quietly by the door in my old faded jeans and oversized t-shirt. I kept my face completely blank, showing them nothing but the empty stare of a grieving widow. I did not say a single word. The tall agent turned back to Trevor, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning level. "Mr. Trevor, the widow did not force you to file emergency paperwork behind her back. She did not force you to lie to a federal judge about her mental capacity. And she certainly did not force your failing real estate firm into millions of dollars of toxic debt. You did all of that entirely on your own." The agent handed Trevor a final document requiring his signature to acknowledge receipt of the federal lien notices. Trevor's hands shook so violently he could barely hold the pen. He signed his name, scratching the ink across the page and sealing his fate completely. The agents turned and walked out of the living room, leaving the shattered remains of the men behind. The silence they left in their wake was heavy, but it was quickly broken by the sound of heavy footsteps storming down the hallway. I turned away from the shattered living room and walked quietly into the kitchen. The heavy footsteps I heard echoing down the hallway were moving fast. The caterers had already fled the property, leaving behind trays of untouched gourmet food and half-empty pitchers of expensive drinks. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. The kitchen was a mess of abandoned prep stations and melting ice. I walked over to the large marble island and poured myself a tall glass of sweet tea. The ice clinked softly against the sides of the crystal glass. I took a long, refreshing sip, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. For the first time in 2 solid weeks, a genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. The sweet taste of the tea was nothing compared to the absolute sweetness of this moment. Seconds later, the swinging kitchen doors burst open violently. My mother Vivian stumbled into the room. Her perfect image was completely destroyed. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and sweat-stained. Her carefully styled hair was disheveled, and her designer makeup was beginning to run down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked frantic, her eyes darting around the room until they finally locked onto me. She marched straight up to the marble island, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Her face was twisted in a chaotic mixture of pure panic and indignant rage. She still thought she could order me around. She still thought she was the one holding the leash. "Valerie, you need to fix this right now," she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with hysteria. "You need to call those federal agents back right this second and tell them it was all a massive mistake. Tell them Julian left the money directly to you and that Trevor was just helping you manage the accounts temporarily. You have to sign whatever legal papers they need to release our banking accounts immediately. They are threatening to take my house, Valerie. My beautiful house. The neighborhood association will find out. The church members are already whispering outside. You have to stop this." I leaned back against the cool marble counter, taking another slow sip of my sweet tea. I looked at her, watching the sheer desperation bleed through her carefully constructed high society mask. "Fix it, Mother," I asked, my voice incredibly light and completely unbothered. "I do not think you understand the severity of the situation you all proudly put yourselves in. You cannot just call the Internal Revenue Service and tell them you changed your mind about committing financial fraud. She slammed her hands down hard on the island, scattering a few loose cocktail napkins across the floor. "Do not play your little games with me, Valerie," she hissed, her eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. "This is entirely your fault. You deliberately set Trevor up. You intentionally hid the truth about how that money was structured just to trap us. You knew he would try to roll the funds into his brokerage. You have to call your lawyer Elias right now and transfer the liquid funds to clear Trevor debt. We are your family. You owe us this much. You cannot let us lose everything we have worked so hard to build." I let out a soft, chilling laugh. The sound echoed in the large, empty kitchen. It seemed to startle her completely, freezing her in place. Her eyes widened in shock because I had not laughed or smiled around her in 18 years. "I owe you nothing," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. "You threw me away 18 long years ago because I was an inconvenience to your precious social climbing. You let me grieve my dead husband entirely alone. And then you burst into my lawyer's office waving fake legal documents to steal the only thing Julian left me. You did not come here to comfort me. You came here to rob me blind." I reached into the deep pocket of my oversized faded jeans, my fingers wrapped around the folded piece of paper I had been carrying all week. I pulled out the fake medical certificate Trevor and my parents had so proudly presented to Elias. I slowly unfolded it, smoothing out the deep creases on the marble countertop. I slid the fraudulent paper across the island, stopping it right in front of Vivian, shaking hands. The bold black letters declaring my mental incompetence stared back at her. "I am legally incapacitated, Mother," I said, quoting their exact cruel words back to them. "I am suffering from severe psychological trauma and immense grief. I am completely mentally unstable. I do not have the mental capacity to fix anything right now. You and Trevor said so yourselves. You signed sworn federal affidavits testifying to my total incompetence. You stood in front of a judge and swore I was unfit to handle my own life." Vivian stared down at the fake medical document. The very tool they had aggressively used to strip me of my human rights was now serving as an impenetrable titanium shield protecting me from their desperate demands. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The devastating reality of their own trap was finally suffocating her. She was choking on her own toxic lies. I picked up the paper and tossed it lightly, hitting her squarely in the chest. The document fluttered to the kitchen floor, landing right next to her expensive shoes. "You wanted to be the ones in absolute control." I continued, stepping closer to the edge of the island until she was forced to lean back. "You wanted the power and the wealth. Well, congratulations, Mother, you have it. You are my legal financial guardians. All of my assets are your assets. But more importantly, all of my debts are now your debts. And unfortunately for you, Julian's massive business empire was built on acquiring millions of dollars of toxic corporate debt before ruthlessly liquidating the assets. You did not inherit a fortune, you inherited a financial black hole, and you dove in headfirst." Vivian shook her head violently, tears of sheer terror finally spilling over her mascara-coated eyelashes and running down her cheeks. "No," she whimpered, backing away from me toward the swinging doors. "No, you cannot do this to us. We will go to the police right now. We will tell them you orchestrated this whole malicious thing. We will tell them you deliberately sabotaged Trevor's business and tricked us into signing those guardianship papers." I took another sip of my sweet tea, shaking my head in pure amusement. "Tell them what exactly, Mother?" "That you and your arrogant son-in-law conspired to commit medical fraud and perjury to steal from a grieving widow. That you intentionally bypassed the probate court to illegally seize corporate assets you did not understand. The federal agents already have everything they need to put you all in prison. They have the forged signatures on the medical documents. They have the illegal transfer requests Trevor tried to make all week. And most importantly, they have Trevor's own recorded confession of corporate embezzlement." Her eyes widened to the size of saucers in absolute horror. You recorded him? She choked out, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid breathing. Every single arrogant word, I confirmed, nodding slowly. When he was drinking my dead husband expensive scotch and bragging to his little country club friends in my living room, he explained his entire illegal plan to use my estate to save his failing firm. He admitted the conservatorship was just a front. I have it all saved in multiple secure locations. So go ahead, Mother. Run to the police. Call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Call the local news stations. Please tell everyone exactly how the wealthy, sophisticated Vivian and Roland lost absolutely everything they owned because they were too greedy to read the fine print on a stolen contract. Vivian's legs seemed to completely give out beneath her. She collapsed heavily into one of the tall wooden kitchen bar stools, burying her ruined face in her shaking hands. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders heaving with the weight of her total destruction. The arrogant, cruel woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, dark, and worthless was now entirely broken. She was completely crushed by the massive weight of her own malicious actions. I stood there and watched her cry, feeling absolutely no sympathy in my heart. She was not mourning the loss of her family. She was mourning the loss of her money, her status, and her fake social empire. You have 24 hours, I told her, my voice echoing coldly in the large kitchen. The federal agents were generous with their timeline, but I will not be. You, Trevor, Jasmine, and Roland need to pack whatever clothes you can physically carry and get out of my house. By tomorrow evening, the locks will be permanently changed and the advanced security system will be armed. If any of you ever step foot on this property again, I will not hesitate to have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Vivian did not look up. She just continued to sob loudly, her entire body shaking with the devastating realization that her perfect, privileged life was gone forever. She would never walk into that country club again. She would never look down on anyone ever again. I left her sitting there weeping in the messy kitchen. I set my empty glass on the counter and walked quietly back down the hallway toward the living room to finish watching the rest of their fake empire burn to ashes. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving my mother sobbing alone on the cold tile floor. The sound of screaming was already echoing down the long hallway, bouncing off the expensive artwork and the high ceilings. I moved silently, my bare feet making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor until I reached the entrance of the living room. I leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. The scene unfolding in front of me was a beautiful masterpiece of human destruction. Trevor was pacing violently back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his face a dark shade of purple. He suddenly stopped and turned his absolute rage directly onto Jasmine. He looked like a feral animal completely stripped of the slick corporate disguise he usually wore. "You did this!" he roared, pointing a visibly shaking finger at his wife. "You told me to file those papers right away. You were the one who found that shady doctor to forge the medical certificate. You said it would be so easy. You said your sister was too weak to fight back, and we could just swoop in and take the money without any resistance." Jasmine scrambled to her feet, her ruined $5,000 designer dress clinging awkwardly to her legs. She wiped the dark black streaks of mascara from her cheeks, her own rising anger rapidly replacing her initial panic. "Do not, you dare try to blame this on me, Trevor!" she screamed right back at him, her voice shrill and desperate. "You are the financial expert. You are the one who told me we had to merge the accounts immediately. You told me it was the absolute only way to save your pathetic failing business from total collapse." She turned desperately to Roland, who was still sitting in the velvet armchair, looking completely hollowed out and gray. "Dad, he lied to all of us." Jasmine sobbed, pointing an accusing finger at her husband. "Trevor did not want Valerie money to protect the family legacy. He wanted it because he is $2 million in debt. His real estate firm is a complete joke and a total fraud. He has been bouncing checks for months, and he told me if we did not steal the estate money, we would lose our house and my cars. He used us to save himself." Roland looked up, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he fully realized the depth of the betrayal. "Trevor, you told me your business was thriving," Roland whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "You told me signing those federal papers was just a simple legal formality to help Valerie transition her assets. You looked me right in the eye and lied to me, and now the federal government is taking my house and my retirement pension." Trevor let out a cruel, mocking laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "You are just as greedy as I am." Old man Trevor spat viciously, taking a threatening step toward my father. "You signed those papers because you wanted a massive cut of the $7.5 million. You and Vivian could not wait to get your hands on Julian money so you could show off to your little high society church friends. Do not stand there and act like some innocent victim. You hated Valerie just as much as Vivian did, and you were perfectly happy to throw your own daughter in a dark basement to get exactly what you wanted." The sound of hurried, frantic footsteps came from the hallway behind me. Vivian rushed past me, completely ignoring my presence in the doorway, and stormed straight into the living room. She had heard everything from the kitchen. The sight of Trevor screaming at her perfect golden child and openly insulting her husband was the final devastating blow that completely broke her mind. Her carefully crafted high society mask shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces right there on the rug. "How dare you!" Vivian shrieked, launching herself across the room with surprising speed. She raised her hand and slapped Trevor squarely across the face with all her remaining physical strength. The sound of her hand striking his cheek echoed like a loud gunshot in the large room. Trevor stumbled back, his hand flying up to his rapidly reddening face, his blue eyes wide with pure shock. "You disgusting, pathetic excuse for a man!" Vivian screamed, moving forward to hit him again. "You come into my house, you arrogant white trash fraud, and you think you can scream at my daughter. We welcomed you into our family because we thought you were successful and respectable. You ruined my golden child. You dragged my perfect Jasmine into your filthy criminal mess. You ruined our entire family." Trevor grabbed Vivian's wrists, pushing her back roughly so she stumbled into the coffee table. "Get your hands off me, you crazy old woman!" he yelled, his arrogant privilege completely gone, replaced by sheer, desperate panic. "You are all a bunch of broke, pathetic social climbers. You pushed your own flesh and blood away because she was actually authentic, and you kept Jasmine because she is just as fake and endlessly greedy as you are. You deserve absolutely everything that is happening to you right now." Roland finally jumped up from his velvet chair and threw his body between his wife and his son-in-law. "Stop it!" Roland yelled, trying desperately to pry Vivian away as she continued to thrash and scream vicious obscenities at Trevor. "We are all going to federal prison, and you are in here hitting each other like wild animals. We need to call a criminal defense lawyer right now. We need to figure out how to undo this conservatorship before federal agents come back and lock us all up in handcuffs. It is way too late for that, old man," Trevor yelled, backing away toward the shattered glass coffee table. "The accounts are frozen solid. The federal tax liens are already filed and active. There is no undoing a federal government seizure. Your perfect little pristine family is completely dead, and it is all your own fault for trusting me over your own daughter." Jasmine collapsed onto the expensive sofa, pulling her knees tight to her chest and rocking back and forth, crying hysterically into the cushions. Vivian was still struggling violently against Roland's grip, screaming words at Trevor that she would never ever dare say in front of her refined country club friends. Roland was visibly hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he tried with all his might to hold his furious wife back from committing an assault. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, watching the absolute beautiful carnage unfold. They were literally destroying each other from the inside out. The highly toxic foundation they had built their entire lives upon was finally collapsing inward, crushing them all. For 18 long years, they had presented a united front of absolute superiority and flawless wealth. They had used me as the designated family scapegoat to hide their own massive character flaws and deep insecurities. But now, with the stolen money completely gone and the terrifying threat of federal prison hanging heavily over their heads, the true, ugly, feral nature of their relationships was fully exposed for the world to see. They did not actually love each other. They only loved what the others could falsely provide for them. Jasmine loved Trevor fake money and his elevated social status. Trevor loved Jasmine blind obedience and her parents' total willingness to cover for his massive failures. Vivian and Roland loved the perfect image their children gave them to project to the outside world. Without the stolen money and the fake prestige, there was absolutely nothing keeping them together except mutual hatred and the incredibly heavy crushing burden of shared federal crimes. I did not feel any urge whatsoever to intervene or stop the vicious fight. I simply watched the devastating consequences of their own malicious actions unfold naturally. I had not raised my voice a single time. I had not thrown a single punch or shed a single tear in front of them. I had simply handed them the rope, and they had eagerly and greedily tied it into their own executioner's noose. The living room sounded exactly like an active war zone filled with brutal accusations, loud, ugly sobs, and the satisfying sound of their fragile egos finally breaking apart. I watched them tear each other apart for another solid minute. The sheer volume of their screaming was starting to give me a slight headache, but it was entirely worth it. Vivian was still trying to claw at Trevor, and Roland was desperately holding her back, his face slick with nervous sweat. Jasmine was curled into a tight ball on the sofa, sobbing so hard she was choking on her own breath. Trevor was backed up against the wall looking like a trapped rat waiting for the final blow. They had completely exhausted their venom on each other. I uncrossed my arms and took a step forward into the room. I raised my hands and clapped them together twice. The sound was sharp and loud, cutting through the hysterical crying and the vicious insults like a knife. "Enough," I said, my voice calm but projecting clearly across the shattered living room. "The show is over." The sudden command in my voice shocked them into silence. Vivian stopped thrashing against Roland, dropping her arms to her sides as she stared at me, panting heavily. Trevor blinked rapidly, his chest heaving as he wiped a line of sweat from his forehead. Jasmine slowly uncurled herself, wiping her swollen red eyes and looking at me with absolute hatred and profound confusion. They were all staring at the scapegoat, the woman they had thrown away and underestimated for 18 years, finally realizing that I was the one holding the leash the entire time. "You really thought you were so much smarter than everyone else?" I continued walking slowly toward the center of the room, stepping carefully around the broken pieces of the glass coffee table. "You walked into my home, you insulted my dead husband, and you tried to treat me like a helpless servant in my own basement. You thought you could just steal my life, and I would quietly let you do it. But Julian and I prepared for this exact moment. We knew exactly how greedy you were, and we built a trap so perfectly suited for your arrogance that you could not help but jump right in." Trevor opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a single excuse, the sound of the heavy wooden front door opening echoed down the hallway. Firm, confident footsteps approached the living room. My family turned their heads in unison, watching the doorway with wide, terrified eyes. Lawyer Elias walked into the room. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, looking perfectly composed and completely out of place amidst the physical and emotional wreckage of my family. He carried a thick black leather binder under his right arm. He stopped at the edge of the living room, his eyes sweeping over the broken glass, the spilled drinks, and the pathetic state of the 4 people who had stormed his office just 1 week ago, acting like they owned the world. Elias let out a slow, disappointed sigh, adjusting his silver wire-rimmed glasses. "Well," he began, his voice carrying that familiar, calm, legal authority, "it appears the reality of the situation has finally set in." Roland stepped forward, his hands clasped together in a desperate begging gesture. "Elias, please," he pleaded, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "You have to help us undo this. You are the estate lawyer. You can file an injunction. You can tell the federal agents that the guardianship was a massive mistake. We will give the estate back to Valerie right now. We do not want the money anymore." Elias looked at my father with an expression of pure professional disgust. "You cannot simply return a stolen car after you have already crashed it into a brick wall," Mr. Roland Elias replied flatly. "You filed fraudulent legal documents with a federal judge. You claimed your daughter was entirely mentally incompetent to steal her assets. You committed perjury, and you actively attempted to embezzle millions of dollars to save a failing real estate brokerage. I am not here to help you. I am here to represent my client." Elias walked over to the dining table and set the heavy black binder down. He opened it, flipping past several pages of dense legal text. He looked up and met Trevor's panicked gaze. "Now that the guardianship has been proven completely fraudulent on camera," Elias announced clearly, "I believe it is time to read the actual terms of Julian's $7.5 million estate." Trevor's face, which had already been incredibly pale, suddenly drained of whatever little color was left. On camera, he repeated his voice barely a terrified whisper. "What do you mean on camera?" I smiled, pointing a finger up toward the corner of the high ceiling. Nestled discreetly behind the custom crown molding was a tiny black dome. I pointed toward the kitchen where another camera was perfectly hidden above the cabinets. I pointed toward the long hallway. "Did you really think Julian would buy an $800,000 beachfront property and not install a state-of-the-art security system?" I asked, watching the absolute horror dawn on their faces. "The entire house is wired, Trevor. Video and audio. Every single room except the bathrooms and the basement. The system streams directly to a secure off-site server." Jasmine let out another loud wail, dropping her face back into her hands. Vivian's legs buckled and Roland had to catch her before she hit the floor, guiding her to a wooden dining chair. Elias nodded, tapping the open binder. "The federal agents who just left were provided with the complete raw footage this morning," Elias explained smoothly. "They watched you, Trevor, physically threaten Valerie and brag about your plans to liquidate her estate to your business partners. They watched you, Vivian, admit that you only abandoned your daughter because she did not fit your social image. They watched Jasmine admit to finding a fraudulent doctor to fake the medical records. The Criminal Investigation Division has every single confession they need, recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition audio and video." Trevor stumbled backward until his back hit the wall. He slid down slowly until he was sitting on the floor. His expensive suit ruined his hands, gripping his hair tightly. "It is over," he muttered, staring blankly at the broken glass on the rug. "It is all over." Elias adjusted his glasses once more, looking down at the open binder. "The trap you walked into was incredibly thorough," he continued, addressing the broken family. "But the federal tax liens and the criminal investigations are only the beginning of your problems, because the true nature of Julian Estate has not even been fully explained to you yet. You thought the debt acquisition was an automated defense mechanism. You thought the holding company simply absorbed Trevor's failing business to protect Valerie's assets. But that was not an accident. That was the entire purpose of the estate." My family slowly looked up from their misery, staring at Elias with a new profound sense of dread. They thought they had already hit absolute rock bottom, but Elias was about to show them that the floor they were lying on was completely hollow. The trap had snapped shut, but the poison was only just beginning to take its final effect. I walked over and stood right next to Elias, looking down at the people who had made my early life a living hell. They were finally ready to hear the truth. Elias opened the binder and smoothed out the first page. His voice was calm and methodical, which only made the information he was about to deliver that much more devastating. When Julian passed away, the initial estate valuations correctly assessed his net worth at $7.5 million. Elias began. However, what Trevor failed to understand when he aggressively filed for the emergency conservatorship was the specific nature of Julian professional operations. Julian was not a passive stock market investor or a traditional wealth manager. He was a corporate debt liquidator. His firm specialized in acquiring high-risk toxic debts from failing businesses and restructuring them or liquidating the underlying assets for a massive profit. Trevor stared blankly at Elias, trying to process the words through his escalating panic. His chest was heaving, and a thick layer of sweat had formed on his forehead. "What does that have to do with my brokerage firm?" Trevor whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming arrogance. Elias turned to the next page in the binder. The crisp sound of the paper flipping seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room. "It has everything to do with your brokerage firm, Mr. Trevor. A year ago, Julian became aware that your business was severely underwater. He also knew that given your history, you and the rest of the family would likely attempt to seize his estate if anything ever happened to him, leaving his wife vulnerable. Julian was a brilliant man who loved his wife deeply. He wanted to ensure she would never be victimized by any of you ever again. So Julian designed a contingency plan, a financial honey trap designed specifically for your insatiable greed. The living room was so quiet, I could hear the sound of Jasmine's shallow breathing. My parents were frozen in their seats, staring at Elias like he was a ghost, delivering a message from beyond the grave. Julian did not leave $7.5 million sitting in a liquid checking account waiting to be stolen. Elias continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. He did not invest it in mutual funds or real estate. Instead, over the course of the last 10 months, Julian used that $7.5 million to quietly and systematically purchase every single piece of debt attached to this family. Trevor, jaw dropped, his eyes widening in pure terror. His hands started shaking again violently. "No," he gasped, shaking his head. "No, that is impossible. The banks hold my commercial mortgages. The investment groups hold my corporate loans. You cannot just buy them without me knowing." "Not anymore, Mr. Trevor," Elias corrected him without a shred of pity. "Debt is bought and sold every single day in the corporate world, without the debtor ever being notified until it is time to collect. Julian Holding Company bought out the commercial mortgages for your 4 failing strip malls. He bought the massive high-interest loans you took out to cover your corporate payroll when your sales dried up. He even bought the financing contracts for the 2 luxury vehicles parked in the driveway right now. Julian Holding Company is the sole exclusive owner of the $2.4 million of toxic debt your real estate firm currently owes." Jasmine let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth to muffle the sound. Her designer dress was ruined, her makeup was smeared, and her perfect social media life was completely evaporating before her eyes. Elias turned his gaze directly toward her. "And it does not stop there," he added smoothly, flipping another page in the thick black binder. "Mrs. Jasmine Trevor Julian also purchased the portfolios containing your 4 maxed-out platinum credit cards. He bought your personal consolidation loan and your massive outstanding balance at the luxury department stores in the city. Your $80,000 of consumer debt is now entirely owned by the estate. You do not owe the banks anymore. You owe your sister." Vivian let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if she had just been physically struck. Roland gripped the edges of his wooden dining chair, his knuckles turning completely white. The color had entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking old and incredibly fragile. Elias slowly closed the black binder and looked directly at my parents. And finally, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, solemn register. "Mr. and Mrs. Roland, Julian was fully aware that you were 3 months behind on the mortgage payments for your pristine suburban mansion. He knew your secret. He knew you took out a massive second mortgage to finance your lavish country club lifestyle and to pay for things like the extravagant family cookout you threw today. You have been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for years, trying to maintain an image you could not afford. Last month, Julian Holding Company quietly approached your primary lender and purchased both of those mortgages in full. The sheer magnitude of the trap finally crashed down on them heavily and completely. The money they had conspired to steal, the $7.5 million fortune they had drooled over, was not a pile of gold they could just scoop up and spend. It was a massive invisible net that had already been cast over their entire lives. Julian had used his own wealth to buy their financial chains. They thought they were stepping into a gold mine, but they had actually stepped onto a landmine. And by filing the fraudulent conservatorship by declaring me legally incompetent, Trevor had legally triggered the absolute enforcement of every single one of those debts. "You bought our house," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her total destruction. She turned her head slowly to look at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of awe and absolute terror. "Julian bought our house, Valerie." I took a slow step forward, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. I looked down at the four people who had made my life a miserable shadow for 18 years. They had thrown me away because I was not good enough for their fake wealthy image. They had left me to grieve my husband alone, without a single phone call of support. They had plotted and schemed to take the only thing I had left in this world, and they had done it all with smiles on their faces. "Julian did not just buy your house, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Julian bought everything. He bought your house. He bought Trevor failing business. He bought Jasmine designer clothes and her luxury cars. He bought your entire fake existence. He bought every single lie you ever told to make yourselves look better than everyone else." I walked over to the broken glass table and looked down at Trevor, who was still sitting on the floor staring into nothingness. "You thought you were the smartest man in the room, Trevor," I said softly. "You thought you could outsmart a grieving widow. You thought you could just push me into the basement and take over my life. But you did not outsmart anyone. You just walked into a vault full of your own debts and locked the door behind you. And when you signed those guardianship papers, you legally bound yourself to pay those debts back immediately. There is no bankruptcy protection for you now. There is no corporate veil to hide behind. You signed a personal guarantee directly to my holding company." The absolute silence in the room was deafening. There was no more screaming. There was no more fighting. There was only the crushing, suffocating reality of their complete and total ruin. They had spent their entire lives treating me like I was completely worthless. They had told me I was a failure because I collected old things from dead people. But they never stopped to realize that as an estate liquidator, I knew exactly how to clear out the trash. "Julian made sure you would never be able to hurt me again," I told them, my eyes sweeping over their broken faces. "He knew that the only way to stop you was to let your own greed destroy you. He left the bait, and you swallowed it whole. You wanted control over my finances so desperately that you volunteered to be legally responsible for your own destruction." Elias stood quietly by the dining table, a silent witness to the absolute dismantling of my highly toxic family. He tapped his gold pen against the leather binder. "As the executor of the Julian and Val Holdings corporate structure, I am legally obligated to inform you that the holding company is calling in all outstanding debts." "Immediately," Elias stated. "Because of the fraudulent nature of the guardianship, the terms of the debt acquisition require full payment within 24 hours or complete forfeiture of all attached assets." They were completely cornered. They had absolutely no money, no credit, and no way out. The federal tax agents were coming for whatever scraps were left, and the estate owned absolutely everything else. The honey trap had worked flawlessly, just the way Julian and I had planned. They had chased the sweet taste of millions right into a financial slaughterhouse. And now it was time for me to deliver the final killing blow and officially claim everything they had ever valued. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of the moment sink in completely. I stood up straight, pushing my shoulders back and looking down at the pathetic group of people sitting amidst the wreckage of my living room. The air was thick with their absolute defeat, heavy and suffocating. I stepped closer to the dining table where Elias had left his black binder open. I reached into the side pocket of the leather binder and pulled out a thick stack of crisp white envelopes. I held them in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of 18 years of pain and rejection packed into those thin paper rectangles. I tossed them carelessly onto the remaining intact edge of the shattered glass coffee table right in front of Trevor. I am not just the heir, I told them, my voice ringing with a cold, powerful clarity that I had never felt before. I am your sole creditor. I own every single debt you have ever accumulated. Trevor stared at the white envelopes as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. His hands were shaking so violently he could not even reach out to touch them. "What are those?" he choked out, his voice barely a raw whisper. "Because you were so greedy, Trevor," I explained slowly, pacing around the broken table. "Because you were so incredibly eager to sign those fraudulent guardianship papers to steal my money. You legally merged your entire financial existence with mine. You gave me the absolute legal right to foreclose on everything you own immediately." "Those are official eviction notices," I replied smoothly, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fits in a garbage bag and get out of my beach house. And by Monday morning, the banks will officially repossess your suburban home, mother and father. They will take your luxury cars, Jasmine. They will liquidate the failing firm, Trevor. You have absolutely nothing left. You are entirely broke, and it is entirely your own fault." Jasmine let out another piercing scream, throwing herself back onto the sofa. She clawed at the expensive fabric, her wails echoing through the house. "You cannot do this to me," she cried, her face buried in her hands. "I am your sister, Valerie. You have to help me. I cannot be poor. I cannot lose my cars. My friends will laugh at me." I looked at the golden child, the girl who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. "You should have thought about that before you helped forge medical documents to declare me insane," I replied coldly. "You made your choice, Jasmine. Now you get to live with the consequences." Vivian was slumped in her chair, her face completely devoid of any emotion. The shock had finally broken her mind. She was staring blankly at the wall, mumbling something incoherent about her country club membership and her garden society meetings. Roland simply wept silent tears rolling down his cheeks as he realized his entire legacy was completely destroyed. The next 24 hours were a beautiful, chaotic blur of frantic packing and hysterical crying. I sat on the back patio, drinking coffee and watching the ocean while they scurried around the house like rats on a sinking ship. They had no money to hire movers. They stuffed their expensive designer clothes into cheap black trash bags, hauling them down the grand staircase themselves. Trevor tried to make frantic phone calls, calling in desperate favors from his wealthy business friends, but the second the news of his federal investigation leaked, everyone stopped answering his calls. He was a financial pariah. By Sunday afternoon, the driveway was filled with trash bags. I stood on the front porch, leaning against the wooden railing, and watched them drag their bags down the gravel. Nobody said a word to me. There were no apologies and no tearful goodbyes. There was only the silent, humiliating retreat of a family that had finally been crushed by their own toxic pride. Jasmine struggled to drag 3 heavy bags to her car, weeping loudly the entire time. Vivian and Roland walked with their heads hung low, refusing to even look in my direction. The months that followed brought a swift and brutal justice that played out exactly as Elias and I had planned. The federal criminal investigation moved quickly. Trevor was permanently disbarred from any real estate practice. His license was shredded, and he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for medical fraud, perjury, and massive corporate tax evasion. His arrogant smirk was finally wiped off his face forever behind cold steel bars. The golden child Jasmine filed for a messy divorce the very second his bank accounts hit zero. Without his fake money or her parents' financial support, she was forced to face the real world for the first time in her life. She moved into a tiny, dark studio apartment on the bad side of town. I heard through Aunt Clara that Jasmine now works a minimum wage retail job at a local mall, folding the very same designer clothes she used to max out her credit cards to buy. She spends her days serving wealthy customers, completely stripped of her own fake royalty. But the most incredibly satisfying justice of all was reserved for my parents, Vivian and Roland. With their pristine suburban mansion officially seized by the federal government and their retirement pensions entirely drained to cover their massive legal fees, they had absolutely nowhere to go. They had burned every single bridge they ever built. They were forced to rent a cramped one-bedroom unit in the exact same low-income project housing complex they had abandoned me and my grandmother in 18 years ago. The universe has a brilliant sense of irony. The people who threw me away because I was not good enough for their high society image were now forced to live the rest of their lives in the very place they despise the most. Their precious church friends completely abandoned them. Their fake empire was reduced to absolute dust. As for me, I kept the beach house. The $7.5 million estate remains safely locked behind Julian's impenetrable corporate structure. I stood on my pristine balcony this morning, feeling the warm, salty ocean breeze against my face. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, watching the sun rise over the water, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. Julian is gone, but the beautiful, peaceful life we built together is safe. The estate is secure, and my heart is completely at peace. 18 years of being the family scapegoat had finally come to a permanent end. I learned the hard way that blood does not automatically make someone family. Family is supposed to protect you, not exploit you. If you are watching this video right now and you are suffocating under the heavy weight of toxic family members who constantly diminish your worth, do not be afraid to walk away. Do not be afraid to set rigid boundaries. Do not be afraid to cut off the people who only love you for what they can maliciously take from you. Protect your peace at absolutely all costs. Sometimes you do not even have to fight them to win. Sometimes the trash simply takes itself out,